Hello, sisters, and welcome to Go Solo Live. This is Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel. It's time to sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy my conversation with Carol Guttery as she shares a little bit about the San Camino Trail, Sri Lanka, and her philosophy about solo travel in general.
Welcome to Go Solo Live.
Don't you mean go solo live? Have you ever been asked why on earth would you travel alone? Go Solo Live not only answers that question, but celebrates life as a midlife solo traveler. This is a safe place for women to come together to reminisce about their travels, encourage others to travel, and to dig into the real lessons learned from these journeys. Now join Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel as she and her guests share stories of the solo travelers of midlife women.
Joining us today is Carol Guttery, who's going to share how she committed herself to more deliberate travel after age 50. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's great to have you here. And I love to just get right started. And we're going to start to hear a little bit about what happened at 50. I know 50 is this huge milestone for folks. What was happening in your mindset when you decided that you were going to make some changes to how you were approaching travel?
There were a couple things going on in my life at that time. My husband is older than me and retired. So he's home a lot. He has a very flexible schedule. And I was finding myself still in a 9-to-5 job. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my commute time into the city was costing me about 2.5 hours a day. And I began to feel like, okay, that I enjoyed the work that I was doing quite a bit, but it was taking so much out of my life to be doing the 9-to-5 job and spending that much time commuting. But I felt like, I think I want to try to rearrange my life so that I can have more control over my time. But I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to do that. So I just took the plunge and I quit my job, which was a job I liked and had been kind of a dream job for me. But I thought, you know what? I need to redesign my life so that there's more room in it for travel, so that my husband and I can do more things together since he's retired. And so I took the plunge and I quit the 9-to-5 job and kind of embarked upon a process and a plan for figuring out what I wanted to do next.
Well, that sounds great. So let's talk a little bit more about what was the job situation, in terms of it was something that you loved. How did they take it when you left? How did that transition plan come to fruition? A lot of people, you hear the stories of, so I up and quit my job.
Well, I wanted to do it on good terms. I'm a philanthropy professional, and at the time I was working for a large corporation that has a major philanthropy program, and I was encouraging had ran programs that encouraged their employees to volunteer, and I had grant-making responsibility, and I didn't want to leave them in the lurch. That's good work. So I just talked to my boss about how I wanted to redirect and kind of reorganize my life, but I also gave a very long notice time. So I gave several months of notice. I helped them interview for and hire my replacement, and then stayed on even then for some overlap time to help that person get up to speed, because I didn't want that work to stop or fall by the wayside after I left. And so I took the time to, help them transition. And I'm still in touch with them, actually. I'm glad to see, since I've left several years ago, their programs are doing great. The company's doing great. And so for me, it was definitely something where I wanted to leave on good terms. And then that couple of months of transition time gave me time to sort of think about how I wanted to construct sort of the next year. So, and one of my purposes for leaving was that I wanted to make more room in my life for travel. So I immediately started queuing up a couple of trips because that's what, those of us who are addicted to travel do.
Absolutely. And there's something to be said for when you have a trip to look forward to, is, for those of us who thrive on travel, when you have that trip in anticipation, you can at least breathe. Like it's this safety net of sorts of, at least I have something coming up.
Yeah, exactly. And so there were two things that I queued up that year that I had been thinking about a long time and were important to me. One of them was that I queued up a trip for both my husband and I to go to Botswana and Zimbabwe. I support a number of wildlife conservation projects through my volunteering and also just for my personal monetary donations. And one of those projects supports the wild African dogs in Zimbabwe, which is a very unique endangered species that is in sub-Saharan Africa. So I had known the project and been involved with them, sort of volunteering from afar for many years. And I was able to go and visit the project on site to see their work. And that was amazing because that was part of, an outgrowth of my own personal philanthropy, was wanting to kind of see their work. So that was such a treat. We did a general safari, not unlike a lot of people who go to Botswana or Kenya will do, but then we added on extra time and we were able to hang out at the project, go out with their dog tracker, see their community development programs and that sort of thing. So that was a personal growth opportunity for me. And in fact, it's sort of what's come out of that now that I am traveling more is that I'm making a point every year to try to visit one or two wildlife conservation projects as part of the itineraries that I create for myself and the passion projects. And I write about them on my blog just to, bring awareness to the projects and encourage people to think about conservation work when they're out looking at wild animals.
Well, I think it makes a huge difference, right? It's like to be able to be right in it rather than to support from afar.
It makes a huge difference. I do, the folks that work on that project also come to the U.S. fairly, a couple times a year to do fundraising events. So it's not like I'd never met them in person, but I hadn't seen a wild dog and they're really beautiful. They're really beautiful animals. So that helped me become even more passionate about the project. And as a result of that, I've continued to support them financially, do some volunteer work. I've done a little bit of pro bono work for them. And I'm hoping to get back to that project soon. So that's just a personal passion thing that I have sort of fed into my travel as well. The year before last, I went to there's a penguin project in Argentina that I visited.
Absolutely.
With the Global Penguin Society director. Last year, I visited a project in Sri Lanka that does conservation work for Asian fishing cats, which nobody even knows what they are. They look like a small house cat, but they're not. They're wild, endangered cats that live in Colombo.
Okay, so let's hold on that for a second.
Okay.
You said Asian fishing cats.
Yes. They fish, the cats. They kind of look like a really big tomcat, and they live in estuary areas. So in Colombo, that means Colombo's sort of grown to envelop all the nearby estuaries. So these wild cats are living in a major urban area, and they prefer to fish, although they'll also, eat small, rodents and that kind of thing. They're kind of opportunistic that way.
Okay.
But, but they know how to fish. And they eat fish. And they go into the koi ponds of the local sort of wealthy homeowners in Colombo, and they eat their fish. It's hilarious.
Yeah, so then they're probably considered rodents or disruptors at that point.
Well, the woman who runs the conservation project there is so friendly that she's done a really great job of befriending all of the security guards in those neighborhoods. And now they know when they see their fish disappearing, or they look at their security video and see one of the cats, they'll call her and let her know that one of her cats is in their neighborhood. So now she's turned it into a conservation education opportunity.
That's pretty great of a personality. I mean, that's the kind of person you need to lead an effort like that. Somebody who can turn that frustration of these koi pond owners to affiliates or however you'd like to call that. But that's amazing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of sometimes when I travel, I'm doing standard tourist things, but I also find that through these wildlife conservation, because that's my passion, I'm, try to find opportunities where I can have that kind of experience and meet people doing interesting things that isn't a tour that isn't, I'm getting a little bit deeper into the culture. And for me, the wildlife conservation thing is an entree into that. For other people, that might be they're a foodie. It might be, visiting the local food trucks, or if I have a friend who's a dancer, and it may be exploring, local dance cultures, it's like sort of finding that hobby or that interest that you have and really seeking that out. And the blog that I have, my shtick with the blog is travel on your own terms. And I write a lot about alternative itineraries that encourage people to go past sort of the top 5 and find things that are in their particular interest area and explore them. So I think people feel obligated. Yeah. They feel obligated when they travel to go to the quote must-see sites. And if you're not into art, don't go to the Louvre. You don't need to spend time doing the thing that you're passionate about. And so my entree is the wildlife conservation, but I really like to encourage people to figure out what that is for themselves and seek that out when they go someplace new.
Well, and I love it because, some of the people that I've talked to, one, for example, has really embarked on her solo travel following a band that she loves. So she's totally a groupie. And she's like, well, why would I go see this band when they come to town where I could go see them in some cool destination and get to go explore? So I love that. For myself, I'm a scuba diver, so I like to go to cool scuba locations. I also love taking cooking classes. So wherever I am, I'm going to make sure that I find a very cool cooking class. But I love on your alternative itineraries, which is a tongue twister, your latest your latest blog as of January says, "Dare to disobey Rick Steves." I'm like, oh! Way to incite.
I have a series on that, actually. The most recent one that you were probably just looking at is for London.
Yes.
I just updated that, actually, because I did it a few years ago, but I was in London again this year, so I rewrote it into a 3-day itinerary. There's quite a bit in there. I also have one from Madrid, Edinburgh, and Northern Ireland. I actually like the Rick Steves guides. I think they're quite practical and budget friendly. But if you look at his guide for London, all of the top stuff, it's very heavily weighted toward the historical sites, like royal relics, Westminster Abbey. And that, a lot of those are the jewels of London, but London's also a very modern city. And so, for instance, the East End of London, which is sort of more gritty and hip, has its own interesting immigrant history that you would never know unless you you went to Shoreditch and you took a history tour. And that kind of like more modern aspect or grittier aspect tends not to make the tour books. So that particular post acknowledges that people want to go to Westminster Abbey or see the changing of the guard, but then also suggests other interesting things to do in those same areas where you can get a little bit more out into the streets. So I actually tweeted at Rick Steves when I was promoting one of those posts one time, and he liked it.
Agreed. No, I mean, that's the best part is that, travel should be very personal. So if you can't figure out I only enjoy so much history. And sometimes some of the history I enjoy surprises me. So, it's always about having a good blend, but knowing yourself rather than just following a guide and, bucking that should be respected.
Yeah. Yeah. People need to give themselves permission to go off script. And because they think, maybe if I'm only going to be in London once, I have to do the top things. And it's like, well, if you're only going to be in London once, do that thing that's really cool. I really like cheese. I'm a real nerd about it. So when I go to London, I go to Neal's Dairy Yard because it's the best cheese in England. And I make sure I eat a hunk of it because that makes me happy.
That's awesome. You're talking to a girl from Wisconsin, so I'd be all over that.
Yeah. So anyway, I actually started my blog that summer out, when I came back from Botswana and Zimbabwe in that summer. Then I made a decision to, as a sort of a head clearing exercise and a what do I want to do next exercise, I decided to take a solo journey, hiking the Camino de Santiago in Spain, which I know you mentioned you've had a couple of guests that have done that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there are about 125,000 people a year who register at the cathedral in Santiago that they've done one of the Camino routes. So interestingly enough, like I did that as a solo journey, but I certainly wasn't alone.
Exactly.
Yeah. And actually, I'd like to make that distinction because in my mind, there's a distinction between traveling solo and traveling alone. They're not exactly the same thing. And I think for people need to find their own right mix of that. For instance, when I did the Camino, I traveled solo. I went by myself. I put on my backpack and hit the trail on my own. And I did have alone time while I was hiking the trail, but I hiked the most popular trail, the Camino Francés. And there were lots of people around. I made a lot of friends. I could hike with or hang out with people if I wanted to. And so there were times when I chose to be alone, but I was solo, but not alone most of the time. And
Do
then
you know that's my tagline? That's my tagline for the podcast is go solo, not alone. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I love
exactly.
that. And I appreciate this conversation. So this is an important conversation and distinction for people. So keep coming.
Well, and then on the other hand, when I was in London recently, since we were just talking about that, I traveled for most of that trip with my husband. But when we go to a place like London, a big city, we always schedule at least a half a day, sometimes more, where we each go off and do our own thing. So he's into guitars, and there's a whole street in London that is nothing but guitar shops, and I'm not going to do that with him. So, and I'm really into bookstores, and I like to go visit the bookshops or eat my cheese or whatever. So we are traveling together, not a solo trip, but we always take time to do our own thing when we're on a trip like that. So we can explore our own passions. So for some people who may want to, they're into this and their friend or their spouse isn't, that doesn't mean you have to be attached to the hip with your traveling companions. So you can not travel completely solo, but also have alone time to explore your own thing.
I really appreciate you bringing that up. And the fact is, whether you're traveling with your partner or with, a friend or a family member, whatever that is, I do think it's helpful to have that conversation and understanding ahead of time, because otherwise I think they can kind of take it personally. But when I travel with people, I'm like, I need my space. I'm an introvert. And if I don't get my alone time, we will all be miserable.
Yeah, I hear that. And you're right. Like especially if it's somebody you haven't traveled with before, you need to have a conversation about sort of the way you like to do that. There's also a third version of this, which is taking a trip and traveling for part of it with somebody and doing part of it solo. So I mentioned Sri Lanka earlier. The bulk of that trip, I went to Sri Lanka and Singapore in that trip. And the two of the 3 weeks of it was a tour I took with a couple of friends. There were 4 of us. We did a organized kind of our own tour of the main sites in Sri Lanka. But I went ahead on my own several days early so I could do the fishing cat thing. And then they went home and I flew to Singapore and spent several days in Singapore on my own exploring Singapore. So in that particular instance, like part of the trip was a togetherness thing. And then I added some stuff on either end because there was some extra stuff I wanted to do on my own. So that's another way to, sort of do part of a trip with the security and the companionship of other people, but adding something on to, again, like to explore your own passions.
So as we're talking about this idea of building solo time before or after a trip to add different elements that you might be interested in, that's actually one of the first things I suggest for people when they're getting their feet wet. What's great about that is, you can go, a friend of mine went to New York City with a group. And so she didn't know anyone in the group, but she joined the trip, went and got to explore it. She then had the ability to become more comfortable with the area and kept, after a couple of days, to stay and do some of her own things, which was great. It's a nice way to become comfortable without necessarily having to do all with everybody else or all on your own. Wouldn't you say?
Yes, exactly. Especially if it's a, place you haven't been before, or if you haven't done a lot of solo travel, that's a get your feet wet kind of situation. Certainly. To be honest, that's not what I did. I had never been to Singapore. So I went to Sri Lanka and I just dove into Singapore on my own. Although that's not a particularly risky way to do it. I mean, they do speak English there. The signage is in English, and it's one of the least chaotic Asian cities you could possibly go to. So for me as a solo travel, it was actually fairly easy entree. But and I love Singapore. I'm totally going back.
That's awesome. Tell me a couple of things that you really loved about Singapore. I am not familiar with it, and no one that I have talked to on the show has spent a lot of time talking about it.
Well, I mean, if you visualize Singapore, you think of like big, high density Asian city skyscraper kind of thing, but 45% of their land is in green space. And there is a lot of parks, gardens, and hiking areas right in the city that are fairly easy to get to on the bus. And so I took advantage of that when I was there. I took several hikes, and even like there are buildings. So the Modern Art Museum has several outdoor spaces built into the Modern Art Museum. So I really appreciated that for a big, bustling city like that, they've been very, very deliberate about maintaining their green spaces, which I think really adds to the quality of life in a place like that. Compared to, say, New York City has Central Park, which is really fantastic, and there's a lot of acreage devoted to that, but it's sort of in one big chunk in the city, and you don't have it as spread out throughout the city like you do in Singapore.
That's fantastic. What other places are you either called to, it's a place that you'd like to continue to go back to, or places that are on your radar to explore? And give me not just the where, of course, give me a little bit of the why.
Well, my next solo trip will be to Iceland in March.
Have you been there before?
I have not.
Awesome.
I've not. And I know it's on fire. Ever since the economy there melted down in 2008, and people became a less expensive destination. It's since bounced back from that, but I think it became really popular. And I really want to see the Northern Lights. And in order to do that, you have to go somewhere north in the winter. My husband was like, "What? You want to go to Iceland in the winter? Can we go to Iceland in the summer?" And I'm like, "Sure, but we can't see the Northern Lights then."
Right.
So, hence the solo of the trip. And there was a really great deal on WOW Air, which is one of the low-cost carriers, sort of like a Southwest Airlines or kind of low-cost carrier. So, for under $500, I got a ticket, and I'm going.
I think that's fantastic.
I'm still working out the itinerary, but I'm optimizing for hoping to catch the Northern Lights. And they have other things there that you can only do in the winter. There's an area in one of their southern national parks where you can go inside of these ice caves that form in the winter. So it's and you can't do that in the summer because the caves melt in the summer. So when I saw pictures of that, I was like, holy smokes, yes, I'm going to go wander around an ice cave in Iceland, because that's what you do there in the winter.
Well, why wouldn't we, right?
Right, exactly. So that's my next solo trip, and that is just coming up in March, and I'm still working on putting the finishing touches on that one. I've always had a roaming list of places I wanted to go in my head, sort of like an evolving top 10, but that was never written down. And just this year, I've actually finally started writing down, I guess it's a bucket list of things I'm really interested in doing kind of before I'm too old to do them, and they're kind of categorized into things like great views, places with great views, which would include seeing the Northern Lights. I'm also trying to queue up a trip to Australia there's a hike you can do on the southern coast, Ocean Coast Road. That's supposed to be really beautiful coastline. So I have a handful of things like that are like sort of epic views I would like to experience. I'm really into street art. So there are a handful of cities that have really great street art that I'd like to see that I haven't been to already. I'm also a book nerd, so there are also a number of places in the world where where literary travel is important. UNESCO actually has a designation. Not only do they do historical sites, but they have a City of Literature's designation. So there are many cities that are UNESCO designated cities of literature, Dublin being one of them. So I'd like to visit some of them. And whether or not I make that, like a public declaration or it ends up just being a private list, I am trying to get organized about making sure that time doesn't pass me by. And I wake up one day and realize, why didn't I ever go to Tallinn, Estonia? They have great street art and there's a City of Literature nearby. I must go. So that's what I'm working on right now.
And I want to just go back for a second to your conversation about Iceland Air. So I do watch their deals a lot. And one of the things that's amazing about that is they often have these layover or stayover type deals. And, when you think about, I love thinking about like the tourism industry in general. I'm not an expert on it, but I like thinking about it as a business, right? So Iceland Air has an interest.
Wow Air.
Oh, sorry. Yes,
Wow
that is more of the discount airline. Iceland Air is getting people to Iceland with an affiliation with the country to then get people to stay over. And so if you purchase a ticket to go to Paris, but you do a layover and stay over a couple of nights in Iceland, there's no extra charges. And the prices are really, really reasonable. So there's a bunch of different ways to really maximize your travel by watching the different airlines and their deals and understanding the story that they're trying to, create as they're building the tourism in those areas.
Yeah, but both of the airlines do that. You can do most airlines will allow you to do what they call a stopover up to maybe 3 days, even a legacy carrier like United or Delta or British Air. But the carriers in Iceland, I think they allow you to do maybe up to 6 days.
Yes.
I could be wrong about that, but it's longer. And to encourage that sort of tourism. And then you can, if you're flying from Chicago I don't know about Iceland Air, but Wow Air hubs out of 7 or 8 cities in the United States. It's not they're growing. So you can do that. And then I could go to Tallinn, Estonia, or I could go to, they have landing spots all over Europe. So, and I know other people who have done that. They'll do a couple of night layover in Reykjavik. I chose not to do that for my upcoming trip because I wanted to really concentrate on being there. But that is a good travel hack. That's how I did the Singapore leg of that Sri Lanka trip. I was on Singapore Air and I flew through Singapore, but just kind of directly to Sri Lanka. And then I did a 3-night layover on the way back. And that didn't cost me any more than if I had just booked an out and back trip.
Well, and I had the same type of experience when I was in New Zealand last. I wanted to stop through Fiji on the way home, and there was absolutely no price difference if I flew home through Fiji versus, through wherever else. So it didn't cost me any more to add that leg onto my trip. I'm like, well, then why wouldn't we?
Well, some of the best snorkel spots in the world are also on that bucket list I'm brewing in my brain.
Yes. Isn't it great? I will say,
I do.
Fiji, I was able to dive with the sharks, and it was at a stunning resort, 5-star type of resort for Fiji, right? The diving with the sharks was quite stunning.
That sounds awesome. Fiji's on my list.
Well, and actually, so one of the things that was interesting about Fiji as well is I was going there for work. I was going to scout it as a location to lead a study abroad. And so my first couple nights I did an Airbnb, and I ended up staying with an Indian family. And so I learned a lot about local culture, what the Indian culture is like in Fiji. And part of their practice with their Airbnb is you all dine together. And it's almost insulting if you don't dine with them. So it was quite affordable and quite an educational, cultural experience just by where I was staying.
I would not have thought of that for Fiji. I would have thought, well, of course stay at the resort, but that sounds to me like a really affordable way to be able to go someplace that otherwise might be kind of pricey.
Well, and what was neat there is then I didn't realize that I didn't really spend a lot of time doing the research. So then I talked to locals. I learned a little bit. I found out that there wasn't much diving on the main island and that you really did need to go somewhere. And I found a place with a last minute booking that was amazing. So I like to kind of wing it, not all the time, because I do have some control issues, but finding a balance has been really rewarding.
And were you on your own on that trip?
I was.
Yeah, so now that's another interesting variation on solo travel where, somebody might think of Fiji as your sort of romantic honeymoon destination, and they do market themselves that way. But yet, you did a solo trip there and were able to get the best of what the scuba diving there has to offer without worrying yourself too much at what the stereotypical, tour might be for that country.
And for the first day I was on the resort, it was me and another couple, and they were on their honeymoon. And, it was fine though, because I really just wanted the peace, quiet, relaxation, and to dive. And they were just learning to dive. So I went out with the dive masters, and it was, again, unexpected and fantastic.
That sounds great.
Well, so I'd love for you to share with us a little bit about your website and how people can really connect with you.
Yeah, so my website is Wayfaring Views. And as we talked about, I help people travel on their own terms by providing independent travelers with destination inspiration and the alternative itineraries that we talked about. And I'm also on all of the social media, wayfaringviews.com. A couple of the things I've come up with recently, we talked about London. I have a whole series on London, including the Rick Steves post, but several others around street art and Shoreditch and several other things to do there. I also did a recent series on Ireland where I have a lot of information available on lots of different kinds of alternative things that you can do in Dublin, and that also includes a road trip. And then my home state is California, and I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I have quite a bit of content around that as well.
Your website is fantastic. It is super pretty, user-friendly, and your writing style, as you kind of say when you write about yourself, is that you have you've been traveling for a long time, you have mad photography skills and a writing style with a fun edge. And I agree. Your stuff is really fun to read, which makes it engaging for everyone. So I really appreciate that. But in addition to putting things together by location, which is super helpful, you also put things together by activity. Can you talk just a little bit more about that? Because I think that's going to be a helpful resource for our listeners.
Yeah, so there's a section on the site called Alternative Activities so for instance, if you're into hiking, I mentioned that interest I have in going to Australia. I love hiking, and I like combining hiking with interesting, I call it hiking and heritage. So it's either an interesting area that has a historical sort of angle to it, or like a really interesting kind of crazy geology. So for instance, last summer, we spent several days hiking the Jurassic Coast in England, which is, a couple 100-million-year-old coastline with fossils on it, and also a lot of really cute Victorian historical towns along the coastline. We did Hadrian's Wall, which is the original Roman border between England and Scotland, and you can hike along the wall and learn about the archaeology there. So you're sort of interested in hiking, but also with a cultural angle to it. There's content about that. I'm a nut for street art, and so I have a lot of content on street art in cities like Chicago, San Francisco, Buenos Aires, San Diego, and on and on. And I think that is street culture is a really interesting way to get to know a city.
Absolutely.
And street art is basically a living museum. So I have a fair bit of content on that. I also, because I'm a book nerd, I also write a lot about literary travel, which could be great bookshops in a city. It could be literary sites in a city. And I also seek out bookish lodgings when I travel.
Cool.
So on that Jurassic Coast trip, we spent the night in a B&B that is also a bookshop, which is amazing.
Yes.
Yeah. So, you can explore on the website if you're interested in a particular type of activity. If you like museums and culture, you like street art, you like hiking and heritage, you like urban walking tours. I've also got the content organized that way. So if it's sort of like, I don't care where I go as long as it has really interesting hikes,
Yep.
then you can kind of get into the website that way.
Well, and have you been to Bogota, Colombia yet?
No, not yet.
I think in terms of street art, you will be quite impressed. So,
well, there's a wildlife conservation project in Colombia that I would love to go and visit. So I could combine those two passions together on that trip. Good idea.
It's a win-win. It's a win-win for
yes,
sure.
Exactly.
I love it.
Yes.
Well, super. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your stories with us today, Carol. This has been, it sets the right tone. And the fact that we really were able to dig into that conversation about the various types of solo travel just means that this is something that is out there more. Solo, alone, the variety between the two. It's a wide spectrum. It's not one or the other.
Yeah. And I think that, by distinguishing between those things and what you're doing with your podcast here, you're offering women a lot of ideas for different ways that they can approach that. I mean, the fact that women are discouraged from traveling solo drives me mad. Nobody would ever say to a guy, "You're going to go there by yourself." It's ridiculous. And so I think the fact that you're talking to folks like me and the other ladies that you've interviewed and that you're doing this podcast at all, and like just putting out there all of the different sort of ways that women can consider owning their own travel life, I think it's really empowering. I'm really grateful that you're doing this.
And I really appreciate that. It's always great to have that kind of affirmation. Carol, thanks again for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Wasn't it great to hear the stories that Carol shared with us today? Keep in mind that there are so many different ways that you can travel solo. Don't feel like you have to pick just one or that something's right or wrong. Do what's right for you, but do it. If you love these stories and want to help support Go Solo Live, you can do that by making a small financial contribution to the show at www.patreon.com/Go Solo Live. That's www.patreon.com. Please stop by and show the love. We've reached the end of another episode, but the conversation doesn't have to end there. Join us on Twitter at Go Solo Live, share with your friends, and if you know someone who would be a great guest for the show, make sure that you reach out to me at Jennifer@transformviatravel.com. And until next time, remember, go solo, not alone.